Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch. My guest today is Spencer Klavan, host of the Young Heretics podcast, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and author of several books, including his newest, which is called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. We spoke today about the potential challenge that Darwinism poses to Christianity and whether or not the Darwinian objection is really just another way of restating the problem of evil. Why nihilism is a very ancient problem, whether or not religion is really just a useful social technology or a useful story rather than a true insight into the nature of reality, and why it is no longer possible for any ideology to be truly pre-Christian, including those that claim to be. The extended version of the episode, as always, is available at louiseperry.substack.com. You can also find the last conversation that I had with Spencer a year or two ago. You can also find, as always, the MMM chat community, which is very active, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the live streams, which I occasionally do with other Substackers, the writing that I do on Substack. Yeah, there's lots there. Anyway, louiseperry.substack.com. I also want to remind you that there is an abridged version of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution coming out in March. I think it will already have been published by the time this episode is released. It is a shorter and slightly simpler and less horrifying version of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, intended for a young adult audience. So kind of 15 to 17, although some younger, particularly mature teenagers might be well suited to it. If you know someone who you think would benefit from reading the book, please consider buying them a copy. Spencer, do you want to start by... I have a specific question to ask you about Darwin, but before I do, I feel like maybe we should just prime the listeners for what your latest book is about in terms of... Well, I don't even want to try and précis it. You précis it because it's your book.
Sure thing. Thanks. And I'm very excited for the Darwin question. I don't know what it is. We're doing it live. But when I started writing this book, I would have said that it's about what is materialism and why is it wrong? Mm-hmm. And now, after the book's come out and seeing the climate into which it has emerged and the other books that have come out around the same time, I'm starting to think that this is actually a book about what was materialism and why was it wrong. The first 2/3 of this book are a brief history of science broadly conceived, so including the natural philosophy of the Greeks and the Babylonians, down to the quantum revolution and some of the modern stuff that's happening with AI, in as rapid a clip and in as engaging a way as I can possibly make it for non-specialists, among whom I number myself very, very much. But the point of all of that is to deliver the book's final third, in which I argue that strict materialism of the kind that really sort of rose to dominate the landscape in the wake of Isaac Newton and his French interpreters has exhausted itself as a philosophy, that whatever's going on, quote unquote, out there, outside our internal experience, whatever the world is made up of, it ain't a bunch of billiard balls knocking together in a void, as the mechanical philosophy would have it. And because that's true, science is coming up again against all sorts of ancient questions about the relationship between mind and matter. Quantum physics is delivering all sorts of results that are very suggestive about that relationship, but that require philosophical interpretation. They can't be sort of answered through the scientific method and experiment. And therefore, we need some kind of philosophical or even theological framework for interpreting those results. And it might just be possible, wonder of wonders, that in the 21st century, one of the best available keys for interpreting those results is the Bible's book of Genesis. So that's the argument. And it's, I think, probably no longer as ludicrous or radical an argument as it even was when I started writing the book, just because of the way that things have been going.
Okay, Darwin, who admittedly is not actually a big figure in your book because you're so focused on physics, but he does come up. And I'm sure you will know, listeners will know, that The Origin of Species was had a very destabilizing effect on Victorian Christianity, and not least on Darwin himself, whose wife was a very pious Christian, but he wrestled with God, and he, I suppose, ended up as an agnostic,
Mm-hmm.
and he found writing The Origin of Species very destabilizing to his faith. And of course, I mean, this culture war now seems quite archaic, but towards the end of the 20th century in particular, the teaching of intelligent design in schools was such a vexed culture war issue. And
Scopes monkey trial, as I recall.
Yes, right.
One?
So, yeah, Darwin was treated by new atheists, which I numbered myself among them at the time, admittedly a very annoying teenager version of a new atheist.
Same.
Yes. What a journey, right?
Right.
Darwin was seen as like the great repudiation of particularly the literal interpretation of Genesis.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that now? I mean, as a former atheist,
yeah,
Darwin thought it was challenging to Christianity.
Yeah.
Do you think it's challenging to Christianity?
Well, I feel like that clip from Hot Ones, the show where they eat spicy chicken wings, and there's Paul Rudd with the host, and he's opening a bottle of hot sauce, and he says, "Look at us! Who'd have thought that we're here now after this journey from like Reddit atheism?" I should say I was never a true full bore atheist, but I was definitely a Reddit bro shortly before there was Reddit.
Oh no!
And like number myself among the young intellectual progeny of the new atheists. Like in high school, my nerd buddies and I considered Christopher Hitchens the absolute sum and summit of all sophistication, wisdom, and knowledge, and thought of physics. And maybe this is why my book is so fixated on physics. We thought of physics as the description of what's really real, and everything else, including any spiritual speculations, was a kind of emanation or an afterthought or a reflection on that. And yes, I think Darwin, The Origin of Species certainly had a major role to play in creating that intellectual atmosphere. And especially with figures like Richard Dawkins, he became the pivotal figure. I think Dawkins cites somewhere, or there is a quote that is often associated with Dawkins from a paleontologist who says, after Darwin, all other answers to existential questions are irrelevant, are moot, and we should jettison them. Aristotle, Aquinas, all these guys have been superseded by a new story about where we come from and what our destiny is. And there are all sorts of figures. I mean, Nietzsche especially, I think, really recognizes this when he says man used to look to the heavens for his origins and destiny. That way has been closed, so he must now look back in time. But back in time, he finds only the ape who stands grinning. So there's certainly, and I think of Darwin himself, and you can correct me if I've misunderstood him, but I think of him as very similar actually to Einstein in his relationship to faith. Einstein had a real love of Jewish scholarship and the Hebrew Bible, was raised with a Jewish education, but basically had his faith shattered by the discoveries of by discovering paleontology. He thought, well, these things can't both be true at once. This can't be literally physically real the way the Bible talks about these 7 days of creation and so forth. And so one thing I write in the book is it's very easy from a conservative or traditionalist perspective to sniff at that and to deride that perspective as a kind of intellectual hubris. But actually, it's the farthest thing from intellectual hubris. There's a real sincerity, almost a touching sincerity, to figures like Darwin and Einstein in this capacity, genuinely attempting to wrestle with what looks like our best available evidence. And in many ways, the scientific revolution begins with the suggestion that God gave us our reason, so shouldn't we use it to the best of our ability to find out the truth? And tragically, for many people, this leads to a moment where it starts to seem as if actually all the answers are contained in material fact. Everything can be generated spontaneously with these natural laws, and there's no room anymore for a divine account of our origins. I think Tennyson's poem In Memoriam really wrestles with this agony and this idea of kind of the Lucretian stream of atoms coming back to dissolve us all. So all that to say, I find it completely understandable that Darwinism in its moment overturned and unsettled and troubled religious believers. I no longer think in 2025 that neo-Darwinism, as it's sometimes called, or a exhaustively evolutionary account of human origins is satisfying enough, even intellectually, to really shoulder out Christianity from the picture. And there's kind of two reasons for that. One is that the actual story that neo-Darwinism would tell about the origin of species and the gradual speciation of the different animals until you get to man has a lot of really serious holes, questions, problems that are not only anymore the province of young earth creationists or biblical fundamentalists, but are actually being raised by evolutionary scientists. For instance, there doesn't quite seem to have been enough time, based even on our kind of modern scientific understanding of the age of the universe, to get to the sort of biodiversity that we now have, that we observe already. So there are these sorts of logical internal questions. And then there are larger, I think, philosophical questions that were never actually addressed or taken off the table by Darwinism, even in its simplest original form. Things like, if it's the case that natural laws in the universe can spontaneously generate organisms and consciousness in humans, where do the laws come from, right? There are these sort of larger meta questions, cosmological questions about the order of the world, which are actually the order of the world still looks very much the way the medievals thought it looked. That is, it's intricately and carefully calibrated to produce exactly the conditions under which, even from an evolutionary perspective, you get these bizarre creatures called humans that have qualitative sensibilities and subjective first-person experiences and reason that kind of applies across the universe. Now, the harder question for me, and the more delicate question, is, I think, actually the one that you are really asking, which is, does this unsettle a literal blow for blow 7 24-hour day interpretation of the book of Genesis, which is an interpretation that is associated, at least now, with Orthodox historical Christianity. There's kind of a high stakes game that Christians are sometimes presented with, which is either you are going to have to accept creationism and reject Darwinism, or you're going to have to accept an evolutionary account, a cosmological account of the Big Bang and redshift and so forth, and at least radically alter what you always said you believed, you Christians, over centuries about the world, which is that it is 5,000 or so years old. And I would say that there is some validity to that claim, to the extent that I agree right now, from all of our best available evidence, it doesn't look to me like the Earth is 7 24-hour days plus 5,000 years old. I think that the most consonant reading of the Bible with science now requires us to understand the book of Genesis in a slightly different way, and to think of the word day there as standing in for some kind of complete period from God's perspective and all that sort of thing. The part that I don't buy is that this entails an upheaval or a reversal of historical Christianity and what has always been believed by the church. Actually, if you read the church fathers on this, there's a much wider variety of opinion and interpretation than has been sort of led on. Yes, you do find people saying these days must have been 24 hours long the way we experience days, but you also find, for instance, St. Augustine reflecting at great length to the effect that it's kind of impossible to imagine these as 24-hour days, especially before the creation of the sun. And so maybe we need to think about these days as using human experience, human language to describe something outside of all human experience and only visible to God and the angels. And this is not only very plausible to me, but also consonant with some of the quantum physics stuff that I talk about in the book, that actually, like, outside of all human perception, things don't operate in ways that are readily conformable to human description and perception, and so need to be addressed in this kind of metaphorical or allegorical language, mythological, in not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of conveying things through story that have no other appropriate mode of description. And so what I reject is not the tension between, like, an old earth and a literal or fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. What I reject is the characterization of fundamentalism as the only form of Christianity that counts as, like, traditional or orthodox. In fact, I think that idea is itself a product of the scientific revolution, because after the scientific revolution, people start to say, well, either things are physically true or they're not true at all. Either they're literally true or they're not true at all. And then you do get conservative Christians who want to stake out the claim that the Bible is physically true in a way that modern cosmology and evolutionary theory is not. But I think that's already a reaction. And one of the things I say in the book is that's kind of giving the game away before it starts. Does that answer the question that you were asking?
It answers one of the questions I was asking. So yeah, I agree. Okay. I think that I'm not too troubled by the literal interpretation of Genesis, because yes, we can take it. I like that idea of a mythical interpretation of Genesis, or a metaphorical interpretation. That seems fine. The thing that I personally find more challenging, I don't know if this was true for Darwin himself, is I have a friend who is a very pious Christian, but she once said to me, I never doubt that God is real. What I sometimes doubt is that he's good. Because that is a fundamental idea within Christianity, right? That God is good. And I feel sometimes as if the theory of natural selection is difficult to square with God being good. Mm-hmm. Because it necessitates such an enormous amount of death and of randomness. And we see how some of our worst traits, some of our most sinful qualities as human beings, have been actually selected for in evolutionary history because they seem to do us good in some way. And that seems very difficult to square with the idea of them being undesirable qualities. And it's actually not that is, of course, the most famous objection to the Bible leveled by Darwinists. But actually it's the moral issue which I personally struggle with more. Do you struggle with it?
Well, yes. Like every Christian ever. I would propose that this is actually not a new quandary that's introduced by Darwinism, but just the old problem of theodicy in a new form. And the problem of theodicy is extremely vulnerable to pat, quote unquote, solutions by Christian jingoists. And those I find incredibly counterproductive, because everybody can see that they don't hold water. And things like God has a plan or everything happens for a reason may, in some distant sense, be true, but don't even begin to address the enormity of the situation that you're addressing. I would say it's the same enormity that we're confronted with when we ask how God can allow, for instance, Dostoevsky gives the example of, like, a child torn apart and tortured by sadists. And I think this is Ivan and Brothers Karamazov who presents this to Alyosha, just as, like, how can, if God is a God who allows that, but ultimately works it out in some grand cosmic scheme, that's just not a God. I can imagine that would be resolved in eternity, but he says, I return my ticket. And I think that's a very serious and grave conundrum for all people to wrestle with, and Christians perhaps most of all, since Christians are committed to the idea of God's goodness. But I don't think you would do away with it if you got rid of Darwinism. I think if you said there's no Darwinism, there would still be children tortured to death by sadists, right? There would still be, from my perspective, and I suspect yours, babies slaughtered in the millions in the womb. There would be all sorts of horrors to contend with. And the answers would probably, I suspect, be the same in both cases. I'm kind of thinking this through out loud, but, when I think about those problems of theodicy, I think, for instance, of the Book of Kings, in which God basically tells the Israelites that having a king is a really, really terrible idea, and all sorts of awful things are going to happen if they choose it. And then they choose it, and all those awful things happen, and then God picks a king for them, out of whom comes Jesus, right? So it seems like if Darwinism of some form is a real feature of the world, it's a real feature of the world post fall of man, and in this sin-riddled and bedraggled and tragic life that we're living, where all sorts of terrible things kind of occur and then are used by God, is, I guess, the typical language. And it would certainly seem like that's what you would imagine God to be doing in a world that operates through this, as you say, extraordinarily ruthless and, from one perspective, quite heartless process of natural selection. I think C.S. Lewis somewhere talks about like the vast waste that goes into, a people like the stars of the sea, ultimately like producing one woman who produces one man who dies once, like that. There's this huge kind of conical funneling effect. And since the main mechanism really of natural selection from this perspective is death, and since death is one of the things that Christians say God did not create, but sin brought into the world, it looks to me like another case of God using kind of an ugly feature of the world for divine or good purposes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about theology is that everyone has come up with every objection you can imagine, and I find this comforting in a way, because people much smarter than me, have come up with objections to Christianity over the centuries and have been satisfied enough with the answer to continue believing. So there isn't really there isn't an argument you can come up with that hasn't been satisfactorily answered by a Christian who's smarter than you at some point.
I really want to write another book someday about Christian heresies, and the title would be "We've Been Over This." I think like that just for the sake of the title, that's kind of what. Yeah, I agree.
I don't know if we're going to get to the bottom of the problem of evil over the next hour, but
right.
You mentioned infanticide as an example of human sin. And one of the things that you do learn from reading about deep evolutionary history, and indeed other species that are quite similar to us, is that infanticide repulses us in a way that it didn't apparently repulse the Romans, but it repulses us. And yet it is a very frequent practice among hunter-gatherers. And it is also a frequent practice among men who wish to displace the children of other men. And the horrible thing is that infanticide, among other horrible practices, is in a sense rewarded, is in a sense selected for, because there are moments when it is adaptive and it leads to the flourishing of some genes and not others. And I mean, I agree with you. It's just coming back to the problem of evil again from another direction, but it is challenging. And I can see why. I think Charles Darwin was also quite mentally ill and struggled with all sorts of psychosomatic illness and depression and so on. But I can see why, for someone born into the much more, a church that felt much more settled and much more confident in itself, I can see how encountering deep human history in its grimmest form could have been very disturbing. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show.
One way of coming at this question might be to say that actually an advantage of some non-materialism, before you can get to Christianity, just something that doesn't exhaust the set of things which exist once you get to all the with material things, is that it allows us to make moral claims against natural selection.
Yeah.
So G.K. Chesterton has a passage somewhere where he says the natural selection can produce a mouse or a tiger, but nowhere in natural selection can you find any means of saying that a mouse is better than a tiger or a tiger is better than a mouse. And in fact, this is something that Dawkins kind of waves his hand at in The Selfish Gene, which is famously about the fact that the gene wants to reproduce, quote unquote, at the expense of everything else. It doesn't really matter what kind of destruction there is besides that. And Dawkins says, some may ask, shouldn't this prohibit us from making moral judgments against anything that somebody does to propagate the species? So in your example of infanticide, on what basis can we condemn or acknowledge or affirm our reaction against infanticide if it is an evolutionarily selective and rewarded practice? And the answer, Dawkins says, is, well, something isn't it wonderful that evolution has produced in us this ability to make all these moral judgments and to be good and virtuous people? And my feeling is not really. In fact, evolution hasn't given any stamp of approval to our virtues and our revulsion at infanticide. It's only some alternate standard or principle that could do that. And so if we want, as we clearly do, to preserve our sense that there are parts of evolution that are bad, that evolution does some things that we don't like, and if we want even to create civilizations that don't have to rely on the raw animal forces of reproduction, then we actually need something other than natural science. We need some system of eternal or abstract ideals that can enable us to say that even though 99% of the time things happen this way, the 1% of the time where it happens the other way is better. I mean, this is the case of slavery is kind of the same, I think. We have a moral revulsion at slavery, which is, as people on Twitter are now very fond of reminding us, is very historically abnormal and in many ways creates all sorts of economic problems, at least for pre-industrial societies. And so if we want to kind of insist that slavery is wrong and that all men are created equal, or whatever version of that we kind of espouse in our national philosophies, then we have to think about something other than utility and other than natural selection. We have to think about like right in the absolute sense.
I'm sure you've read Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity.
Yes, yes, yes.
I reread it recently. And one of the things that he does, which is so interesting, I think that he was an agnostic as well. Does that sound right? I think he had a complicated relationship with Christianity. Yeah. One of the things that he does is he treats Christianity itself as a unit of natural selection, in a sense. He doesn't express it in those terms, but he wonders why would this faith outcompete others, including in it, well, because one of his innovations was to say it had less to do with evangelism than with Christians reproducing more, at least in the early centuries. And it's a fantastic book. It's justly considered a classic, but it's again, it's a slightly disturbing way of assessing the faith. I reread it recently. I mean, I often think that one of the reasons why a rather compelling piece of proof in favour of Christianity being true is how poorly societies have fared as they've de-Christianized.
Yes. And in fact, higher birth rates is one advantage of Christianity that is now perhaps going to become materially germane in a way that it was not, even a generation ago. This is something.
Returning to the sort of 3rd century, in that sense.
But I don't know. Do you think that that's all that disturbing? I mean, I feel like it's a sign. I mean, one reason I guess why Christians and I think the Orthodox Jews reproduce more is because of their belief in like humanity as a valuable thing in and of itself, which is actually kind of also an ideological advantage.
Yeah, so you can certainly fold it into belief without too much trouble. You could say, well, of course, Christian teachings are going to cause the flourishing of Christians because they're true, And so if God was going to, for whatever mysterious reason, if he was going to send his son at this exact moment, it's because he knew that was the exact moment that was necessary in order to propagate the faith, and the people who believed obviously prospered. Maybe not in the moment, famously Christian martyrs of the early centuries, right? But it was selected for because it's true. You can fold it in that way without any trouble. An alternative view, though, of course, is to say the reason Christianity is the most successful religion that we know of and remains the most popular religion in the world is because it scratches certain psychological itches,
right,
which we have in us because of our monkey evolution. And that doesn't make it true. That just makes it appealing.
Yeah, this is kind of a Yuval Harari point of view now. He's very into narratives and stories, not as truths, but as social technologies.
Yeah.
And I suppose that in a philosophy seminar sort of way, there's no eradicating that uncertainty. I don't think you'll ever prove one way or another, because it's almost prior to proof which stance you adopt here. But I will say that in the age of AI, or at least the age of AI hype, it certainly seems like the causation is running the other way around. It's like when you have machines that can do all of these things, which previously were thought only to be human things to do, suddenly again you have to ask, like, what's the point of humanity? Why should humanity exist at all? I mean, this is something that I've just recently been kind of on a tip about, so maybe it's foremost in my mind, but the way that machines have kind of eerily outstripped us at doing math and even in some cases like summarizing a bunch of different news articles and digesting information, has called into question kind of why you would yourself exist, why you would want more people like you to exist, and therefore why you would want to reproduce. And the answer again has to be because of your quickly it's becoming that the only really viable answer is because humanity is a good per se, because there's something indispensable about each human soul. And yeah, again, that might just be kind of the most useful fiction that we have available now to preserve our reproductive drive. But in order to adopt that stance, I think you also have to adopt like a totally agnostic stance about the truth value of any claim, right? Like if it's not possible to assert the value of humanity as an actual truth rather than a merely useful fiction, then it becomes impossible to assert anything as an actual truth rather than a merely useful fiction. Like if the things that we most firmly believe we believe only because subconsciously we find them useful for reproduction, then you have pulled out the rug from underneath all your beliefs, which are all now suspect as something that's just, which like, right. I mean, many people have been really into that for a long time, but I also feel like it's kind of a dead end a little bit, it doesn't really wash.
Yes. It's a perilously attractive form of nihilism that Darwinism, I think, in particular attracts. I mean, I look at my children, I think, I love you more than anything in the world. And then Richard Dawkins sits at the back of my head and says, no, you just love your genes. This is just an emotion conjured into being by your desire to preserve your genetic material, And right. I agree with you. If you start thinking in that way, nihilism is the only path left available to you.
Yeah, and interestingly, this is the conundrum from which Socrates begins Greek philosophy. So again, it's not actually a new problem introduced by modernity. It's been rendered more acute. It's kind of come back into vogue recently. But one of the most provocative things that Leo Strauss ever said is that when you take modern philosophy and postmodernism to their ultimate conclusions, that's where Socrates begins. In other words, Socrates accepted all of the problems that are raised by people like Heraclitus, which do just amount to everything is a kind of product of your environment, and everything you think is conditioned by power structures that surround you and by biological imperatives. And it's having acknowledged all of those challenges that Plato's Socrates kind of embarks on the quest to find some stable truths that aren't dependent on those things. So none of that is to say that like the nihilism won't continue to haunt us, or that these arguments won't remain powerful in some sense. Just that the one trap we fall into, I think, is the quest of like wriggling out of these complexities altogether. It's like somewhere somebody is going to make such a resounding argument that forever will the libs be pwned, right? Like, and they will remain pwned like unto eternity, or whatever your flavor, whatever, pick your poison. And that's not the kind of questions that these are. Like these are eternal questions. It's funny, every time we do a podcast, I end up citing our mutual friend Mary Harrington, but she had a thing recently where she talked about her experience with, I believe it was Derrida. It was one of the French post-structuralists, and I'm pretty sure it was Derrida. And she talked about what an exhilarating thinker Derrida is, which is true. He's somebody who gets a lot of like reflexive hate on the right, but he's very much a powerful and penetrating observer of some of the problems inherent in language. And she said it became a kind of neurosis because it's a form of deconstruction you can apply to everything. You can start to see it everywhere. And in the same way that you can look at your kids and you see like Darwinian imperatives, I could trot out all the usual reasons why I find that an unlikely explanation for your love for your children, but they wouldn't ultimately exercise that demon. That's just always a possibility. And it's also one reason I think why like weirdly, Christians don't talk enough about faith. Like, faith is the thing that you can't prove, and it actually, in some ways, it is like faith has to be earned by exceptionally rigorous intellectual questing, because only after you've exhausted all of your probative abilities and reached the question that can't be resolved one way or another by a definitive argument do you have to take a leap of faith and choose one or the other options.
One thing that Christian faith demands is the belief in human exceptionalism. Just going back to your AI point. And okay, 2 Tom Holland quotes I want to throw at you. One of which you think you'll just find interesting, but the other is more sort of substantive to what we're talking about. There was a recent Rest is History episode. Do you listen to the Rest is History?
Totally love that show.
Okay, have you listened to the John Dee episode? Dr. John Dee.
No, I don't think so.
It's just come out recently. It's very good. He was, for listeners who don't know, he was the favoured magician of Queen Elizabeth I, and he was an alchemist.
Dee, by the way, one of my favorite figures. I'm very excited to listen.
I really interesting. Great episode. Yeah. Why is anyone listening to this? They should just go and listen to the Rest of History right now. Anyway, the comparison that Tom made between alchemy and the way that it was regarded at the time, including by the Queen herself, which I found really interesting, is he compared it to AI in the sense that it was held to be, by the greatest thinkers of the time, or some of them, this great scientific discovery that was just on the edge of being accomplished and that would transform everything about the world, and particularly would be great for the nation's wealth, right? If only alchemy could allow us to turn base metal into gold, then England's fortunes would be made. And in the same way that AI is one of these technologies that could make us so abundantly wealthier than we could even imagine. That's why alchemy was of interest to the Queen, right? And to all sorts of other people of the day. I thought that was really interesting. I thought of you when I was listening to this, and thought I will tell Spencer about that when we speak. Relatedly, when I spoke to Tom Holland on this show, he famously sees Christianity everywhere, right? I asked him, can you think of an example of a modern ideology which is not Christian? And he said that the best example is environmentalism, or at least some strains of environmentalism, which don't actually think that humans are exceptional, and certainly don't think that humans are good, that actually regard humans as being a stain on the earth. That is one of the, increasingly quite influential ideology that is deeply not Christian, and which I find repulsive. The idea that humans are something that the earth ought to shrug off, I obviously find repulsive. But yeah, I mean, if you don't take that leap of faith and say that the humans are good, that's where you end up.
Well, first of all, I think it's in the British Museum where you can find one of John Dee's little pentangles, or whatever the sort of disc was that he was using to chart the relationships between the metals and so forth. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to trot out the room number, but somewhere, if you are wandering,
I'll go try and find it. Yeah. I hope the artifact he used for his magic that was mentioned on the Rest is History, which I found the most intriguing, was he apparently had an obsidian mirror through which he would try and communicate with ghosts or angels or something, but he couldn't do it. So tragically, despite being such an accomplished magician, he couldn't actually, communicate with the other world, except the other people did. But anyway, I found that obsidian mirror a very arresting thought.
Absolutely, and quite like an extremely suggestive concept that he was honest enough to say, this is something I can't we think of alchemists or somebody like Dee as just kind of making whatever claim, and they're all unverifiable, so you can make whatever claim you want. But in fact, it sounds like he genuinely thought there were proofs of the success of some of his endeavors and not others. And of course, and this I talk about in the book, alchemy is not pseudoscience, it's proto-science. It's the it comes from the same Greek root as chemistry, and really chemistry is what replaces alchemy as the true discovery of occult properties in raw materials. in the same way that physics sort of replaces, or rather emerges out of astrology. Astronomy emerges out of astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And so personally, I have like the greatest respect for alchemy and astrology, at least in their historical forms, in the same way that I have a lot of respect for the Babylonian priests who would like cut open sheep and look at their entrails, in that they were giving evidence of a belief that there are reliable cause and effect processes that govern the world. It just wasn't those ones. And so, yeah, the bigger one, it's funny, this is when I reviewed Dominion for CRB, the Claremont Review of Books, I kind of raised this issue of like, so many strains of Western thought seem to be like arising out of Christian ideas, Christian impulses that are demonstrably very different from pre-Christian ideas and impulses. And of course, Tom shows this brilliantly in the book, and it's a wonderful piece of writing. But my question was sort of, is there such a thing as a strain of Christianity mutating so extensively that it no longer makes any sense to call it meaningfully Christian?
Yeah.
And I gave the example of like the communist gulags. You know, communism is one of the things that Holland identifies with Christianity. And I think there's some obvious truth to this, you know, having to do with the poor inheriting the earth. But also there's a long strain of thought relating communism back to Plato's Republic. And also, you know, when you end up executing Christians en masse, like how Christian are you really, you know? But I think he's surely right about environmentalism. It has all the stamp of paganism. It very, very clearly, in some cases, almost literally. I mean, I'm thinking now of the Apple commercial that sort of advertised their sustainability goals by way of Octavia Spencer as Mother Nature, who comes sweeping in
Gaia.
a cloud of dark thunder. Yeah, Gaia, exactly. And threatens destruction, but then is offered like evidence of faith and sacrifice, basically, and then is made moderately more happy, but warns that, you know, if more is not done, she will return. And what was so riveting to me about that is like the people that made this ad think that it's a metaphor, but they don't understand that it's really not. Like, it's actually the most direct possible expression of this point of view. And by the way, the most sophisticated pagans would also have known that about their myths. Like, they did not think, many of them, that Gaia was somewhere to be located in space and time, but that she could be represented that way, and that we could communicate like fundamental urgent truths, including that humanity is a stain, a chemical scum upon this larger system, which must be propitiated and will demand human sacrifice if not satisfied. I guess the other candidate that's coming to my mind is what I'm starting to call the Babel builders. And that's not technologists. It's not all technologists, but I think of, you know, when Brian Johnson went on Barry Weiss's podcast and said, you know, we thought that God made us, but what we're realizing is that we're making God. You know, we're creating this sort of super intelligence that transcends us in all these ways. And the implication was will eventually rule us and will perhaps supersede us. And that's obviously also grotesque to me, but it shares all sorts of clear ideas with the description of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, that we're going to like make a name for ourselves and build a tower whose top reaches heaven, which is actually a project of dragging heaven down to earth, you know, and does displace the human as like the object of God's special concern and care. And it almost kind of travels in the opposite direction. So if environmentalism like subjects humanity or relegates it, diminishes it to like a footnote in this much larger structure, which is itself kind of sentient or alive or transcendent, then in some ways like AI maximalism kind of elevates the work of human hands to a godlike stature, and then ends you up in the same place, which is that humanity itself is kind of an afterthought or obsolete. But I think, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of things, and I might go further, I don't know, than Tom Holland would on this. I think there are all sorts of strains of modern thought that have been taking on a pagan character for some time. I think Epicureanism has been very much in vogue by other names for a while. I think it might be something more like, it's not that everyone is Christian, but that it's impossible to be pre-Christian. Like all of these paganisms are also post-Christian in very identifiable ways, and bear the marks not only of a return to kind of pre-Christian ideas, but of a decay of Christian ideas back into these original forms.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.